Good morning, class. Hope everyone is doing well this morning, although it's probably not morning for a lot of you. But we're going to do a new unit today. We're going to start a new unit, so you should have already taken your exam by now. I'm diligently grading them right now. I'm sure, and then this will be our last unit of the year. This is it. So, last couple of lectures, last couple of crash course videos, and last examination as well, which will probably be probably like the last day or the penultimate day of school. Right. So we're actually going to focus today on what I call like a modern America unit, or sometimes it's phrased as the rise of conservatism, because after that leftward liberal swing in the 1960s, the country kind of shifts back, especially in the 1980s, under President Reagan, and kind of oscillates back and forth, that pendulum that way, that I've mentioned multiple times in class. So today we're going to start that unit with someone who's actually not that conservative, although he was a Republican. The Republican Party today is the more conservative party, and probably was in the 1970s too. But Richard Nixon was kind of more of a moderate in terms of his politics. We're going to focus on his presidency and the environmental movement today. So um, let's get started on how that all happened. Okay. So Richard Nixon, which is this guy down here, actually it's a little bit bigger, which is this guy down here, came into office after the 1968 election. It's a wild, wild year. If you remember back to the Cold War unit, on one of the crash course videos, I asked you to provide a list of reasons that made that year such a wild year. You could have mentioned the Tet Offensive. You could have mentioned the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the DNC riots. Thousands of people were rioting outside the Democratic National Convention or Committee, and that kind of turmoil didn't look good for the Democratic Party, which had been in charge of the country since 1961 in the presidency, and going back to the I guess back to the 1940s for the Congress. So the Democratic Party looked really, really bad because Vietnam War was spiraling out of control. There was race riots all throughout the country, and typically, as voters, we hold people accountable in office. And when one political party doesn't do a good job, they get thrown out in favor of the other one. That's precisely what happened here with President Nixon, right, who you might recall ran for president back in 1960 against JFK, but lost that election. So Nixon is kind of a weird political animal. On the one hand, he had intensely conservative beliefs, like he was staunchly anti communist, um, but he also had a lot of pretty liberal beliefs as well, which will be the subject of tomorrow's lecture. Although I might not do a lecture, I might give you guys some kind of an assignment for that. I'm still thinking about it. But Nixon is going to be the beneficiary of the mistakes of the Democratic Party. If you look at this map, you can see right here, 1968, he wins an overwhelming majority of the electoral votes, although he didn't win a huge majority of the votes because it was split between Hubert Humphrey, who was on the Democratic ticket, and George Wallace, the guy who was gave that speech: segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That guy. He ran for president in 1968, the governor of Alabama. Um, he was actually assassinated. Well, he was shot. He wasn't killed immediately, though. He still lived. Um, he won these couple of deep, deep South states on this concept of segregation. As late as 1968, people still believed that that was something that was going to come back. So Nixon is going to represent sort of the beginning of this rise of conservatism, even though his actual governing philosophy, or at least his governing policies, aren't going to be that conservative. President Obama, for instance, when he was asked by a news reporter whether President Obama, was the most liberal president we've ever had, which was something that a lot of historians and political commentators had said during his presidency, he said, well, actually, Um, you know, I don't think that I'm doing anything all that different from, say, what Richard Nixon did, right? It's interesting to think that he picked Richard Nixon and not, you know, FDR, right, who's considered, a liberal icon, or even um, President Johnson, who preceded President Nixon. So it's interesting that he picked out him, and there was actually good reason for that. A lot of people gave President Obama a lot of pushback for that, but he actually has pretty good historical backing for why you would think that Richard Nixon is one of the most liberal presidents in American history. There's also reasons to think he's not, but there's a case to be made there, right? And so the way he got elected was because of um, the mistakes of the Democratic Party and what he called the silent majority, right? So the mistakes of the Democratic Party were an excess of liberalism. They kind of allowed a radical wing within their party, people who were more socialist, people who were kind of, I mean, it's one thing to criticize, say, American foreign policy or our tax policy or whatever it is. That's great. That's part of our freedom of speech. It's another thing to sort of bash the country, to argue that the country is bad, that there's a kind of inherent problem with the United States. Um, and that's what the new left was doing. They were criticizing the United States and actually parroting like the communist line of the we are the imperialists and we are responsible for the Cold War, um, and that didn't go very well for a lot of Americans. And allowing those excesses of liberalism, that kind of new left radicalism, into um, into the room of the Democratic Party, didn't sit well with a lot of people. And Nixon argued he was going to have a quote silent majority, that there was a minority of people, the political protesters, who were loud and getting coverage on TV, but they didn't represent a majority of people. They were just the loudest, most vocal people in the country, but they didn't really represent what most Americans believed. So Nixon argued that there was going to be a silent majority that he represented that was going to come out on election day and vote him in. And he was actually right. That's precisely what happened. And that's why he became president in 1969. So let's look at what he did once he was in office. The main thing we're going to look at today is the environmental movement, specifically as regards energy policy. Environmental issues at this time took on national and even global significance for the first time in modern history. And there's a couple of reasons why. The kind of big picture reason that I actually don't have written here is because of increased wealth. I should actually probably write that. Increased wealth. Increased wealth. Capitalism. Countries that are not rich can't afford, literally, to care about the environment. They're just trying to survive. They're just trying to get enough food to eat that day. They're just trying to have their crops grow. It's only once you become wealthy and affluent, you have luxuries the way that we experience here in the United States, that you can even consider the environment as something that you need to protect, um, and that you need to conserve. So increased wealth is actually the kind of the macro reason. More specifically, this will be more in your book. The and just to back up, so the reason that I include things like this is that my background is in intellectual history. That my PhD is in intellectual history, so I look at how ideas change policies and what people think over time. So that's why I kind of always start very big picture, and then I kind of narrow it the way that your book does. So the more immediate reason is a book called Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson in 1962. And this book it's not a history book, it's not a science book, it's just a novel. But much like Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, that we learned about during the progressive unit about the meat packing industry, it was just, it was a fake book. It was a fake book. It wasn't, like a true story, but it was speaking in a way that seemed true. And Rachel Carson's book is going to do the same thing. She's going to talk about environmental degradation, the over manipulation and overuse of resources. And the title should be clear. A silent spring is one that's all dried out. By spring, she means like water, not like the season. Okay. So Rachel Carson sort of brings this to life in 1962, and within a decade, the American people are demanding new regulations on their energy consumption and how much you know. By the late 19, well, by the early 1970s, states of California, for instance, are regulating how hot and cold you can keep your home because of an energy crisis, right? So I'm going to show you a quick clip on how the first Earth Day was started, and it kind of speaks to the crises that were happening within and across species. And then we'll kind of get to these other reasons here. Okay. So that should give you an idea of some of the crises, whether it was energy use or pollution or extinction of species that the environmental movement was referring to at this time. Okay. And part of that is because we were using more energy than ever before, which is more true today than it was back in the 1970s. So, although this has not changed, we're continuing to use more and more and more energy. We have done a number of we've we've worked in ways to try to mitigate against that energy use by offsetting it through environmental legislation or just environmental consciousness, things that you don't need laws for. You just, um, you don't litter because that's, it's not nice to do. It's not a, good thing to throw your garbage on the ground. That's unhealthy and it leads to all kinds of bad um, health consequences for the human species and for the surrounding species as well. Okay. The other thing is fear of environmental consequences due to the use of resources. And by that, I mean, if you use too many natural resources, the fear was that you could run out or you could cause destruction. You've probably learned about climate change in your science classes before, and that's the kind of argument that they would have used here. Um, that wouldn't have been the argument they did at this time, but it's the type of argument where if you use natural resources, there are consequences to that. And what are those consequences? Sometimes they're good because they run hospitals and schools and all that, kind of give us neat technology. But there's also negative consequences as well. And you have to kind of look at both sides of that equation before making a determination. Okay, so these are the major reasons why we had an environmental movement in the 1960s and the 1970s, and why most of you probably know that Earth Day is sometime in late April each year. Okay. Here's some examples. I'll give you guys a moment just to kind of pause the video and read through this. I'm not going to read to you, but you can pause the video at some point and read through these. These are the kind of statements that scientists were coming out with at the time. So I'll give you a moment to read this. I'll get rid of my picture too. And then there's a whole nother list of these kind of statements. You can read these on your own time too. And the point that these scientists are trying to make is that we're going to lead to utter devastation, right? So hundreds of millions of people starving to death, horrible consequences by whatever year it is, 1985 or the year 2000 or the year 1990. So whatever it is, these things were going to be really bad. Now, we know that none of these things actually happened, but this is the kind of um, reporting that these scientists were doing at the time. They really believed that we're going to run out of resources. So we're going to do a quick exercise to finish up today's lecture on what kind of resources do we use and when are we going to run out of them. So there's three main, I guess we could break it down into two main categories. Fossil fuels are kind of an umbrella, like a big tent idea in terms of energy consumption. Two of the most prominent fossil fuels that we use are coal and oil. We also use natural gas as another big one as well. But I want you to kind of just Google. You can pause the video now and Google how long it's going to be until we run out of coal and how long until we run out of oil, and then maybe how long it's going to be until we run out of fossil fuels. Right? And then after you do that, after you figure that out, maybe you can leave it in a comment to see what your peers came up with as well. So comment now and then watch the rest of the video when you're done with that comment. So you should have found something along the lines of, here, I'll do it right now myself. How long until run out of, I don't know, oil? Something like 53, yeah, 55 years, right, is the estimate over here. And then let's change it to coal. Coal, 53, 54 years, and then fossil fuels, 3 years, right? So that can't possibly be right. If oil was 55, then both combined can't be 53. So I'm going to show you a different way of understanding this. So someone who's like an ecologist would probably come up with these kind of arguments, but economists look at it a very different way because they consider how we are extracting these fossil fuels and how efficient we can become at doing that. So I'll show you a very interesting video on this point.
Another contemporary economic myth is that we're running out of resources. This fear that we'll use up the Earth's natural resources has been with us pretty much since the Industrial Revolution. Since the beginning of industrialization, people have feared that as firms used up the Earth's resources that we would eventually run out of them. And this fear continues today. However, this is largely a myth. In fact, we're not running out of resources. What we're doing over time is learning to use resources more efficiently and finding substitutes for resources as they do begin to deplete. For example, consider the story of copper. In the early 1960s, telephone use in the United States was expanding enormously. At the time, the only way to carry the data for telephones was over copper wire. And so as telephone use began to expand to new parts of the United States, the demand for copper began to rise. As the demand for copper began to rise, so did the price. The result of this is people began to worry we wouldn't have enough copper to wire the entire country for telephone use. But as we know, we managed to get around this problem. How did we get around it? Well, two things happened. First, as the price of copper went up, copper producers found new sources of copper that were previously too expensive to explore. More important, we saw the development of substitutes like fiber optic cable, which is made out of sand. Now we carry our voice and data through fiber optic cable rather than copper, conserving on the use of copper and providing us with more of the services that copper was delivering. Another example is oil. Ever since crude oil was first refined in the 19th century, people have been concerned that we would eventually run out of oil. This became even more of a concern in the 20th century with the development of the automobile and the increasing demand for oil that came from that. But despite the concern that we might be running out, the reality is that proven reserves keep growing year after year, even as people are concerned that we're running out. If we look more closely at the data, what we find is that in 1882, estimates were that only 95 million barrels of oil remained. Given that we were consuming oil at 25 million barrels per year, that wasn't going to last very long. But by 1919, oil was still with us, and Scientific American reported only 20 years of oil left. Fast forward to 1950, over 30 years later, oil's still with us, and then the American Petroleum Institute estimated 100 billion barrels of oil left. Notice, that's 10 times the oil that was left in 1882. By 1956, people were predicting peak oil in the United States by 1970.
So peak oil means we have used more than 50% of all the oil on the earth. That's the idea. So we've reached the peak of the amount of, or we've reached the peak of the graph, and we're going to start going on the downward slope at that point.
By 1956, people were predicting peak oil in the United States by 1970. But by 1980, remaining proven oil reserves were at 648 billion barrels. By 1993, 13 years later, that had grown to 999 billion barrels. By the year 2000, it was over a trillion. And most recently, in 2008, best estimates are 1.2 trillion barrels of oil remaining. When we put all this together, what we discover is that we're not really running out of oil. In fact, as oil prices rise, what oil producers do is to begin to look for new sources of oil. The reason why those proven reserves keep rising is because as the price goes up, it becomes profitable to search for oil in places that was previously too expensive. So as a result, we end up finding oil that we didn't know existed before the price began to rise. You can think about prices the following way. Prices are an incentive wrapped in knowledge. And so when the price of oil or copper rises, it does two things. It provides the knowledge to producers that signals to them it's time to find substitutes or it's time to find more efficient ways of using the good. But not just the knowledge, it also provides them with an incentive to do so. At the higher price, again, new sources of resources become more profitable. As consumers balk at buying the good, substitutes become more profitable as well. So if we're really concerned about running out of resources, the answer is not to restrict our use of those resources, but to give the price system and competition in the market economy the maximum play possible to create competitive prices that provide producers with the knowledge and the incentive they need to economize and to find substitutes as resources begin to get more scarce.
Mm-hmm. That last point is actually a really good one because imagine we had restricted the use of copper back in the 1960s. We never would have come up with fiber optic cables, which means we never would have been able to figure out a way to use things like the internet or cell phones or anything like that, because fiber optic cables were kind of the bridge to the wireless technology that we use today. Right? So if we had restricted the amount of copper and said, okay, you can only produce so much, it would have delayed that entire process. Right, so we don't actually run out of resources. This is a fear that a lot of people in your generation have, and a lot of people in my generation have. But it's not it's not born out of knowledge. It's just not supported by the data. So here's a quote from one of my favorite authors, Steven Pinker. He's a professor at Harvard. He teaches history and psychology. He wrote a book called Enlightenment Now a few years ago that I read. And I'm paraphrasing him. It's almost word for word. I kind of cleaned up his language a little bit. But the point is, we don't ever run out of resources. Ever. There's no such thing as running out of resources. He says that the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. The Bronze Age did not end because we ran out of bronze. Plenty of wood and hay remained when we transitioned to coal. Coal abounds despite the fact that we shifted to oil. Oil abounds now, even though methane, natural gas, rises. Right, so we don't run out of one resource, completely have it depleted, and then move to another. We start to move from one to another well in advance as technology shifts. And we're not going to be using coal and oil and natural gas 200, 300 years from now. It's just not going to happen. We're going to have more technological innovation and growth the same way that we're not committed to bronze and stone of 3,000 years ago. That's just kind of the way it works. And again, we don't use wood and hay to keep us warm in the winters. We use other forms of technology. We didn't use all the wood in the world or all the hay in the world. It's just not the way that it works. If you really want to see what the data looks like on this, I have it here. No, I don't have it here. I have it here. Here it is. So the end of proven reserves is about 73 years, right? The end of economically recoverable reserves is about 201 years. And I'm talking about fossil fuels here. End of technically recoverable reserves is 700. That means that we don't have the technology yet, but with more innovation, it's estimated that we should be able to extract those resources. The total amount of fossil fuels that we have in terms of time is about 1,000 years worth, factoring in things like population growth and increased energy consumption. Okay, we have something like 10 trillion barrels of oil in the world, right? That it can be recovered in one form or another. Now we haven't proven that they're there. They're not. We haven't actually probed the Earth and figured out exactly where it is, but the very best estimates suggest that that number is going to continue to increase as we just learn more about the Earth and the resources that it provides. And again, nobody thinks we're going to still be using coal or oil to provide our energy 1,000 years from now. I mean, think about how different the world is, in the 21st century as compared to the 11th century. Like radically different world. Can't imagine we would still be using things like trains and cars 1,000 years from now that are powered by fossil fuels. Just not going to happen. Okay. One more graph to show you guys. This is the amount of oil by country. The United States has the most oil of any country on planet Earth, with the most energy resources in the world. Not that that's probably not technically true, but we are able to tap into them at a higher rate than anybody else. So we have access to those more than any other country in the world. We actually export more fossil fuels than we import. So we buy some from other countries like Saudi Arabia, or actually our number one and number two partners are Canada and Mexico. That's who we get most of our oil from. Well, we get most oil from ourselves. And then Canada is number two, Mexico is number three, Saudi Arabia is number four, and so forth and so on down the list. But we actually export even more than we import. So we're what's called a net energy producer, not a net energy taker. Okay, so in sum, in this increased industrialization in the 1960s and 70s and a reliance on natural resources, that generated an environmental movement in the 1960s and 70s, which fostered things like the first Earth Day in the year 1970. And they wanted more clean air, more clean water, and the Nixon administration responded with new legislation in order to improve that. Actually, I might have left this out early. It's the Clean Air Act, 1970, and the Clean Water Act. It's 1970, maybe it was 1971. Earlier or not. I can make an adjustment for next time. All right, so that's the main idea of today's lecture. Tomorrow we'll focus more on his domestic policies with regard to things like poverty, race relations, gender equality, and all that. I'll see you guys then.